Before the Union, Somalia was a UN trust territory.
Under
Lee's administration.
Wow.
They lacked a pre-existing independent government.
With the legal capacity.
They didn't have the same legal standing as Somaliland, which had already achieved
recognized independence.
So if Somalia wasn't fully independent, their claim over Somaliland rests on,
I think the implication is,
appropriating Somaliland's pre-existing
legitimacy,
existing sovereignty.
Yeah,
to bolster their own standing
on the international stage. So essentially, they might have used Somaliland's credentials
to gain recognition.
They didn't rightfully possess.
Wow, this is mind-blowing stuff.
It is. Was Somalia even in a position to enter this union as a legitimate...
as an equal partner?
Somalia, before the Union, never actually achieved
full legal statehood. But if that's the case, where does that leave Somaliland? I mean, they had their independence.
They did.
Got pulled into this messy union.
Yeah.
Somalia wasn't really keen on signing the treaty.
The treaty?
Yeah, the one that was supposed to make this union official.
Ah, so they were dragging their feet.
Totally. And here's the kicker.
What?
Even without a signed treaty, a proper agreement from both sides. Somalia just went ahead and declared the union anyway. Could you imagine the chaos?
It's like, you agree to meet for coffee and suddenly they're moving in.
Exactly.
No lease, no discussion, just boom, we're roommates now.
I'd be a little freaked out.
Yeah, exactly.
And on top of that, the new government was, how do we say this? A little dominated by Somalis.
Yeah, not exactly a balanced power-sharing situation.
Not really.
Yeah.
And that created a lot of tension up in Somaliland.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Businesses started moving down south to Mogadishu.
Following the power.
Exactly.
So Somaliland felt left out in the cold.
Big time.
Yeah.
And it's not just hurt feelings here.
No, definitely not.
This is serious legal stuff.
Yeah, legal limbo.
And now what?
This brings us to...
a crucial concept.
A crucial concept in international law.
Okay, what's that?
State continuity.
State continuity?
Yeah. Somaliland's statehood, established in 1960, never legally ceased to exist.
Even during the Union?
Even during the Union with Somalia.
So they're saying, hey, we were a country before. Got caught up in this mess. But our statehood never went away.
Never actually went away.
Are there any historical parallels?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely, to this kind of situation?
The Baltic states reclaiming their independence.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union is a prime example.
So it's like saying, just because someone steals your car doesn't mean it's no longer legally yours.
That's a great analogy. And there are other examples like Syria.
Yep.
Regaining its independence after the dissolution of the United Arab Republic, which had been formed with Egypt.
Recognizing the continuous existence of a state, even when it's overshadowed, is crucial.
Is crucial for upholding international law.
Okay, I'm starting to grasp this whole idea of state continuity.
Yeah.
But how does it actually play out in Somaliland's case? In 1991,
Yes.
And they did so...
not as a separatist movement.
Not as a separatist movement.
But as a restoration.
As a restoration of their pre-existing sovereignty.
Got it.
They argue they were simply reclaiming what was rightfully theirs.
What was rightfully theirs all along.
And then there's the whole issue of the UN seat.
Yes.
Which gets even more complicated.
It does, yeah.
Somalia is occupying a seat that should rightfully belong to them.
That's right.
Correct.
And here the state continuity argument
really comes into play.
Comes into sharp focus.
Yeah.
The UN Charter. Essentially the rule book for the international community. Recognizes Somaliland's independence date.
Of June 26, 1960.
June 26, 1960.
But somehow, Somalia ended up
holding the seat. Yeah.
So Somalia is occupying a UN seat. Based on Somaliland's independence.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Somalia applied for UN membership. They essentially used
Somaliland's documents.
Somaliland's independence document.
To support their application.
It's
a case of misrepresentation.
It is, potentially using Somaliland's legal standing to secure a position they weren't entitled to.
This is starting to feel like identity theft.
It is. It highlights the danger of Somalia's narrative.
On national scale.
Which consistently frames Somaliland as a breakaway region. And this framing not only misrepresents history,
it does,
but it also undermines Somaliland's claim
to continuous statehood.
Yeah, to continuous statehood.
I'm seeing how language really matters here.
It does.
Calling Somaliland a breakaway region completely ignores their prior independence, their legal standing.
Their whole fight.
Their whole fight for recognition.
For recognition, yeah.
Right.
By casting Somaliland as secessionist, Somalia tries to delegitimize their claim and control the narrative.
Both domestically and internationally.
Domestically and internationally.
But as we've seen, the historical and legal realities are much more complex than that. Somalia just went ahead and declared the union anyway. Can you imagine the chaos?
It's like, you agree to meet for coffee and suddenly they're moving in.
Exactly.
No lease, no discussion, just boom, we're roommates now.
I'd be a little freaked out.
Yeah, exactly.
But here's the real head-scratcher.
Okay, what?
There's no record of any treaty of union between Somaliland and Somalia at the UN.
Seriously?
It's a big blank space.
So we've got Somalia claiming this union that was never really officially, put on paper.
Never formalized, yep. The union was so messed up, legally speaking. June 26th, Somaliland throws off British rule.
And to, make it official, Somaliland's and the UK signed agreements, right?
Right.
Cementing Somaliland's right to govern itself, their status as a sovereign nation.
Huge.
We actually have a visual of that document. It's called Agreements and Exchanges of Letters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right here.
So you'd think, okay, independence achieved, time to celebrate, right?
Yeah, pop the champagne.
But, get this, just 5 days later, Somaliland decides to join forces with Somalia, which was Italian Somaliland at the time.
Right.
Sounds like a unity move, right?
Well, this union wasn't as straightforward as it might seem. I mean, from day one, it was just riddled with issues.
Okay.
So there were 2 different versions of the Act of Union.
2 different versions?
Yeah, one drafted by Somaliland, one by Somalia, and neither was officially signed.
Hold on. 2 different versions.
I know, right?
That already sounds messy.
It's like, imagine 2 people, they decide to get married, but they each write their own wedding vows, and then neither of them actually signs the marriage license.
Yeah.
Is it really a marriage?
No.
So right from the start, it raises these questions about what both sides were really agreeing to, and its legal foundations were basically non-existent.
It's almost like building a house on sand.
Exactly.
So are you saying that Somalia is essentially sitting in a UN seat that rightfully belongs to Somaliland?
That's a key argument that's being made, yes. Somalia, by leveraging Somaliland's 1960 independence and the UN agreements, they basically took a seat at the UN table that...
Do we have, any concrete evidence of Somalia actually using Somaliland's credentials to gain recognition?
Absolutely. Take a look at this. This is Somalia's application to join the UN General Assembly.
Okay.
And they specifically reference the agreements between Somaliland and the UK from 1960.
Okay.
As if these agreements somehow prove Somalia was independent. It's like trying to cash a check with someone else's name on it.
So Somalia was basically trying to piggyback on Somaliland's independence.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's outrageous. But didn't Somalia eventually gain its own independence separate from Somaliland?
But remember, at that time, Somalia was still a UN trust territory under Italian administration.
Right.
They didn't go through the same process that Somaliland did.
Right.
Their path to statehood was fundamentally different.
Okay, so things got complicated pretty quickly. So what does this mean for Somaliland today? Are they trying to, separate from Somalia, like a formal secession?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Somaliland isn't actually about secession. It's about what's called state continuity.
State continuity.
Yeah, they're not trying to create something new. They're trying to reclaim something that already existed. They were a sovereign nation, and that they never legally stopped being one.
So it's less about starting fresh and more about reclaiming what was taken.
Think of it like this. Imagine you owned a house, right? And then someone just moves in without your permission and starts claiming it as their own.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be trying to secede from your own house, right? You'd be fighting to reclaim what was rightfully yours.
Okay, so are there any, historical parallels to this situation?
Absolutely. A good example is the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Okay.
They were forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union.
Right.
But they always maintained that their annexation was illegal. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, they successfully regained their independence based on this principle of state continuity. Their argument was, we never stopped being independent nations, even though we were occupied.
Gotcha. So Somaliland is basically saying, our sovereignty was taken from us and we want it back. But do they have a strong legal case? What kind of evidence are they using to support their claim?
Well, Somaliland has key pieces of evidence. First, there's their 1960 constitution, which very clearly lays out their status as an independent nation. Take a look at this. This is the original document.
Whoa, a primary source.
Yeah.
I love it when we get to see the actual historical documents.
Me too.
So cool.
Second, the fact that the Acts of Union were never ratified further weakens the argument that there was ever a legal basis for this union. It's like two people agreeing to live together but never signing a lease, you know?
Yeah.
It's just a shaky foundation.
Yeah, so they never really made things official.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more compelling. In 2005, the African Union, they sent a fact-finding mission to Somaliland to kind of assess their claims.
Okay.
Guess what they found?
Don't tell me they agreed that the union was never legally binding.
You got it. The AU mission concluded that Somaliland had a strong case, and that their situation didn't set a precedent for other separatist movements in Africa. Essentially, they acknowledged that Somaliland was a unique situation.
So even the African Union is saying, hold on, this doesn't add up.
So we've established that even the African Union recognizes that Somaliland's situation is unique, and that the so-called union was never legally binding. Remember, when Somalia applied for UN membership back in 1960, they presented themselves as the Republic of Somalia.
Right.
Even though, as we've discussed, they hadn't actually achieved full independence at that point.
Right, they were still under Italian administration.
Exactly.
So how did they get approved for membership?
Well, it appears that they used the agreements and treaties that Somaliland signed with the UK in 1960 as evidence of their own independence.
So they basically showed up to the UN with someone else's credentials.
You could say that.
Wow.
And this misrepresentation has had long-lasting consequences.
Yeah.
It's effectively allowed Somalia to occupy a seat, but some legal experts argue that Somaliland has a strong case given the historical evidence and the legal inconsistencies surrounding that 1960 union.
It seems like they have a pretty solid, legal basis for their claim. Earlier, you mentioned something called state continuity. Can you explain that a bit more and how it applies to Somaliland's situation?
Absolutely. State continuity is this idea that a state's legal existence can continue even if it's been occupied or annexed by another power.
Okay.
It's a legal principle that's been used in several historical cases, like the Baltic states we talked about earlier. Somaliland argues that their sovereignty was never truly extinguished. It was merely overshadowed by this flawed union with Somalia.
So they're not saying we want to become a new country. They're saying we never stopped being a country. It's a subtle but important distinction.
Exactly. And this principle of state continuity is crucial to Somaliland's argument. They're basically saying, look, our forced inclusion in Somalia was wrong from the start, and you can't build a legitimate claim on an illegal foundation.
So it's like saying you can't steal a car and then claim it's legally yours just because you've been driving it around for a while.
That's a great analogy.
Uh-huh.
And to further strengthen their case, Somaliland points to the fact that they've been upholding their end of international agreements that they signed back in 1960 when they were briefly independent.
Oh, wow.
This shows that they're committed to the rule of law, and it strengthens their argument for being recognized as a responsible member of the international community.
So we've got the situation where Somaliland has a strong legal argument, a history of peace and stability, a commitment to international law,